Chiefs walking up and down the streets. It's somebody's life. But when I'm dreaming, I'm flying. If I were to ask you what it means of who you are, if I were to ask you your identity, Mary Ellen used this wonderful phrase, it's our identity. She used that phrase, our identity in God's love. Well, if I said, who are you? You might come back at me with a couple of different definitions or a couple of different aspects of you, of what you do. You're on a flight with somebody, so who are you? What do you do? And you might have a job description, or you might have a relationship description, or you might have sort of what your purpose is, what you're doing at that moment. There's a lot of ways in which we identify ourselves. We identify ourselves by our roles. We identify ourselves by our jobs, subconsciously. Sometimes consciously, we identify ourselves by our judgments. Leon Wieseltier, who was for a long time the literary editor of the New Republic magazine, is now retired and an author, and he wrote an interesting book called Against Identity, because in this book he suggests that oftentimes we identify with labels, and it's a uniquely American thing to do. It's a Western thing to do, to be sure, but it's even more so uniquely American. So we start to identify with the newest trend. We start to identify with the newest craze. We identify with certain communities. And the interesting thing is, it looks like that's a part of community that we're becoming. But in reality, we're simply seeking to figure out who we are, and so we identify with things, while at the same time, we've never really come to terms with who we are. It's an interesting phenomenon. And what he suggests in his book is that if you really want to know who you are, more often than not, we begin to define ourselves as we get older, as we mature, as we begin to explore. We begin to define ourselves who we are by who we are not. And increasingly, we live in a culture of polarities. When I think about who I am now as a Christian, and I was rather vulnerable as I shared with how I understand Scripture. When I came to if you looked back at my life earlier, for example, my life in relation to God was centered around prayer. Not contemplative, not meditative prayer. It was mostly centered around supplication. I needed stuff. That's how I understood God. When I'm in a real dire need, God's there to help. So as a kid, when I was 5, I've shared the story before, I asked God to ask Jesus to tell Santa to get me an electric Fender Stratocaster because I wanted to be a rock star. Because that's who I wanted to be. That was my identity. And you know what happened? I got a ukulele for Christmas. And I just left with that experience thinking, well, look, obviously I'm just not good enough, right? I just don't make the grade. I'm not getting God's attention. And that remained my understanding of God for years. And then as a preteen, as a young teen, I got into a lot of trouble, a lot younger than most teenagers get into trouble. I got into some serious trouble. We'll have some private conversations and I'll share it. I don't want it on the internet. Some of you know me, know what that was, but I got into a lot of trouble. So much trouble on one occasion that I found myself sitting in an office somewhere and praying to God. God, get me out of this situation, and I promise I will never be this stupid again. I prayed. Then when I was a young teenager, I got myself involved in sort of another way of living that got me involved in a number of relationships, and I got really, really sick with a very bad case of mono. Not because of my relationships, not because of what I was doing. But because I was also living a pretty wild and crazy life, I didn't just get mono, I got strep throat. And I didn't just get strep throat, I got pneumonia. I got it all at once. And I was in the hospital at 13 years of age. This is, again, remember, this was several years after the other troubles. At 13 years of age, I was in the hospital for almost 8 days because I was so totally dehydrated. It happened around Halloween, and I kid you not, my younger brother, Mike, who's a member here in this congregation, he will tell you that on Halloween night, when my mom first realized just how sick I was laying in the living room on the couch with a white sheet on me. And when kids had opened up the door and looked inside the living room, they screamed because they thought I was part of the Halloween decoration. And my mom took me to the hospital that night because I was so dehydrated, had 104 fever, and I was just miserable. And I prayed to God, if you get me out of this, I will never do stuff like this stupid. Then when I was in college, so you know where this is going. Obviously something wasn't working, and I'm not sure exactly what it was, but I had in my mind that at least a part of it was that I wasn't good enough. I wasn't somehow connecting to God. I needed to try harder to get to God because all my prayers weren't working. And then something happened. After I got married, Linda and I went to Colorado, and all my life as a child, whenever my family would take us to Colorado, I wanted to climb the mountains. I just wanted to get up high to see things. And so Long's Peak was one of my great goals as a young adult. And so I'm 24, 25, and we're in Colorado, and I slept that night in a tent at the base camp, and we'd been acclimating for only a day or two, not giving it near enough time that you need to do. And then the next morning, you should be up at 3 o'clock in the morning, meeting them at the base of the trail and head up. You got to get down before noon. The clouds come in, the thunderstorms roll in. You got to get down before you get surrounded by the electrical storms. They got stuff at the top of the mountain, these stone circles that are about 3 feet high. If you don't get down in time, get in those circles so you're not the highest thing up there. And I started at 8 o'clock in the morning. I woke up at 6:30 or 7, and I just realized, I'm here to do this. I'm not coming back. I'm going to do this. And I ran up the trail. I just ran to try to make it up to the top before it got too late. And I was exhausted, but still surprised at how far I was getting. And when I got through this place they called Keyhole, which is this big rocky part of the mountain, and you're then scrabbling on the other side of these steep 1,000-foot drops, and you're sort of scrabbling along the rocks, I was moving at about 5 feet a minute or even more. It was so exhausting. The air was so thin, and then there was this crevice that went up high to the peak. I probably wasn't very far from the top. I made it about 3 feet. I had to stop, catch my breath, my heart and my head pounding. 3 more feet, I had to stop, catch my breath. A couple was coming down the mountain with some other folks rushing down because it was almost noon. You could see the clouds in the distance. And I said, how much further? And they looked at me and they said, you don't have time. And I said, how much further? And they said, it's probably still 100 yards. You won't make it. And then this woman looked at me, and they were probably in their 30s. I was in my 20s. And she said, I can tell you this much. The beauty that you see from up there, it's already down here. And if you don't stop to see it here, you're not going to see anything different up there. So just sit for a moment. You'll miss it. And I understood what she was saying, that sometimes we trek to get to the top and realize the whole trek was where most of the beauty was. The top was just the goal. I made it. So I turned around and started following them down, and I was the last one to come down that mountain. And actually, Linda was panicked because she had heard somebody had fallen from the mountain earlier in the day, and she hadn't seen me because I was the last one coming down. And she'll tell you, she was literally crying when I got off the slope because she thought, I was so far behind the others. But I realized at that moment, that was the first experience I had of what it means to be present to the journey, what it means to be present to the walking, to life in the moment. And I'm not sure exactly if that's the only thing, but from that point on, I stopped asking God for stuff. I just tried my hardest to say thank you and to pay attention and to try to get out of my own head. And I'm 40 years into that project and still trying, but getting a little closer. My understanding of my relationship to God changed because I no longer saw myself in relationship to God as a supplicant, but I began to see myself more as a participant. And that's really what this text is about. We think sometimes, or at least a lot of folks think, this text is about Jesus saying, I'm the Son of God, here I am, I'm the King, this is what's fulfilled now because you see the prophecy here. But if you look at it really closely, what you see is Jesus is saying, you have failed to see what's present. And this is what's present. God's present, God's kingdom is now fulfilled in your hearing. It's here. The lame shall walk, the deaf shall hear, the blind shall see again. This is the year of the Lord's favor. That technically is a term that's known as the Jubilee, the year of Jubilee. That's known as the establishment of God's kingdom. The reality, the presence of God's kingdom is here. That's what it's all about. Now, one of my favorite quotes I put on the back here, I think we have a hard time getting into God's kingdom. And I think that, and when I say getting into, I don't mean getting into above or getting into some other place. I mean simply opening the door that's present with us at this moment and entering into that kingdom, letting go of the one way and seeing it a new way. It's hard for us because I think we become familiar with this whole idea of identity. We get trapped in this whole struggle with trying to know who we are in relationship to one another. And we stop really seeing who we are. We only see who we think we are or who we believe we are. There's this wonderful story that comes out of China about this man who finds a mirror. It's an old story. He finds a mirror at the marketplace and all the stuff that he's buying. But when he looks in the mirror, having never seen one of these glass objects before, what does he see? He sees this old man looking at the mirror. He sees what he thinks is a picture of an old man. So he puts it back in because it's kind of interesting, and he puts it back in his stuff, and he goes back to his little cabin, and it's sitting under the bed, so every now and then he might look at it because it's kind of fascinating. Never seen anything like this. Well, his wife gets it, right? And when she looks into it, she sees this younger woman, and she thinks, my husband has a picture of a younger woman under the bed. She becomes jealous and angry, and they get into this big fight, and there's pots and pans and sticks and rocks involved, and after a moment, the glass breaks, and she realizes when she starts to see reflections of other things in those broken pieces that she was, in fact, not seeing someone else, but herself. And they make up, and she finds an ice pack and, puts it on his head. But what's interesting about the story is that so often we see what we believe rather than believing what we see. Do you know what I'm saying? We see what we believe rather than believing what we see. So that when we talk to other people, the real risk is that oftentimes we think we know what they see because we already believe something about it. Whoopi Goldberg, I'll never forget once, she was the host. I don't know if she still is. I haven't watched The View. When I was traveling on my own, I used to have time on certain mornings, and I would watch The View. Any other View fans in here? That's sad, isn't it? Okay, anyway, so it's a great little show. In some ways it is, and in other ways it's just fun to watch because it's sort of like a sweet Jerry Springer in a way, But so she said in this, I'll never forget this, she said, I don't have any mirrors in my house. And no one could believe that. It was like, what do you look in to make up? And she says, well, I don't do a whole lot of makeup. But I just don't look in the mirror because I know how hard it is for me to see what's actually there instead of seeing what I think should be there or what ought to be there or what I believe about myself is there. This way I can be more authentic and just try to relate to people how they relate to me. I think that's an interesting challenge. When we see other people, so often we see them the way we believe about ourselves. It's hard to get around that. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the mystic, I quoted him on the back here, and I used him in my blog this last week. You can look at the quote with me. I would say an individual dies when he ceases to be surprised. I am surprised every morning that I see the sunshine again. When I see an act of evil, I'm not accommodated. I don't accommodate myself to the violence everywhere. I'm still surprised. That's why I can hope against it. We must learn how to be surprised, not to adjust ourselves. I am the most maladjusted person in society. That's the challenge. How do we get to that place of maladjustment? How can we practice that kind of maladjustment that doesn't look for confirmation? but instead looks for transformation? How can we get to that place that opens us up to what we don't know? Did you hear about the new planet? First of all, how many of you were depressed when Pluto was taken off the list? Yeah, they took a planet away. How can they do that? But now there's a new planet, right? You've heard about it, right? Did you read up about it? Nobody's seen it, right? But it's there. But nobody's seen it. And how do they know it's there? Right? Mathematicians, astronomers, they've been inferring by the behavior of objects at the outer reaches of our solar system. And that behavior of objects is very similar to behavior of other objects when they're revolving around a larger body with the relationship of gravity. So they're inferring by this presence of these actions by these other objects that there is something larger around which they are related. I'm going to say that again because I think maybe you're getting my drift, right? They're inferring that this huge body exists because of the relationship of those others around it. When we come to recognize how interconnected we are, when we begin to open up to all of those relationships, I believe people see us for who we are more authentically. And in that practice, we get to be a little more enlightened. But it requires some letting go. And I'm not going to spend any more time this morning on this. I'm going to spend some more time next week on just how we get maladjusted. We're making our way towards the season of Lent. We have this next Sunday as a season of Epiphany, the season in which God is revealed in our world, the season in which we begin to think in terms of how God is revealed in the Christ's birth and in Jesus and in his ministry. And so I want to think with you more about what it means to be maladjusted. I want to end, though, with just this last image to move us on our way. And this is our relationship and how those relationships illuminate who we really are. Not the beliefs. And I'm going to keep coming back to that. And I hope you'll rest with me because I know it's challenging sometimes. But instead, when you think of the root of belief and what it means, the relationships. If I say I believe in the mystery of God, then how is that evidenced in my relationships? If I say I believe in the compassion that I'm called to be a part of, then how is that evidenced? Belief is not a concept, it's a verb, it's a love. It means to embrace and to love. This last Sunday, after I said that wonderful little statement, some of you said, well, at least some of you said it was wonderful. It just kind of came to me Sunday morning before I'd preached, and I said that it would be greater, we'd have a greater odds of having a biography written about us than winning the lottery. You remember that? I said we'd have a greater chance of having a biography written about us. Now think about that, than winning the lottery. And I was blessed to be a part of a memorial service for one of our members here who hadn't been very active over the recent years, but was very active early on in 1111. A man by the name of Stuart Turnage. Some of you know Stuart Turnage. I talked with his wife, Anna. We were planning on a small memorial service of about 60 people. Stuart was an unassuming kind of individual. He had a few odd jobs here and there. He DJ'd for a lot of parties. He sold insurance, sort of self-employed. He was a wonderful individual. He helped us with our sound when we first got started in here years ago. He died, unfortunately, tragically, at a young age of 52. And it was sudden, the night before the New Year's, or 2 nights before December 29th. So we had planned just a casual gathering. 60 chairs set up. Some candles and a picture. 250 plus people showed up. We were knocking down tables and kept putting in more chairs and kept crowding things forward. And then there was only 5 pizzas for the people, and there was only 1 pie. And somebody said, what are we going to do? And I said, 5,000, feed the 5,000. I was trying to remember the parable. I know it can happen. I was trying to see how this, I just was having, faith. It's going to happen, And then Paige and some other staff members came in and said, start the service and we'll go get some pizzas. And so they brought more pizzas, and we had 15 pizzas, and we had tons of refreshments, and more people came in. The Fort Worth Bike Association had 15, 20 bikes parked out here as they came to be a part of this. I looked around the room. Every ethnic variety was represented. Every age was represented. Every socioeconomic status was represented. I thought, who was this guy? He was such an unassuming individual. And the thing went on for an hour and a half. And what we all discovered is we came to know Stuart better by all of those with whom he had related. As we think about who we are, perhaps that's the way to think about our biography. We will be known better by those with whom and what we relate to. Amen.